The issue that we're going to discuss, as I said, is a very simple one, but it's actually very profound. How do we know that development programs are actually working? You know, it's hard to imagine a question that is more basic than that and more fundamental. And yet, all too often, government agencies and private development programs fail to think that basic question through carefully enough. And the result is that we have an unfortunately long list of projects, development projects, that haven't really succeeded. The one answer to that is our topic today, impact evaluation. It's a relatively new discipline, and today the plan is for us to give you an overview into what it's all about and to whet your appetite. In future projects or future webinars, we will look more closely at specific development issues, such as early childhood development, water and sanitation, mother and child health, and also education. But now let's get down to business. Our guest is David Evans, senior economist in the chief economist's office for the Africa region of the World Bank. Dave has a long and impressive resume, but I will keep it brief and just give you the basic facts. He coordinates impact evaluation work across sectors for the Africa region. He's designed and implemented impact evaluations in agriculture, education, health, and social protection in the Gambia, Kenya, Sierra Leone, and Tanzania, as well as in Brazil and Mexico. And he also was in charge of evaluating or assessing the economic impact, I guess I should say, of the Ebola crisis in West Africa in 2014 and 2015. So we hope today's session will produce a really vigorous give and take. My goal is to be as much in the background as possible. So, but that's up to you. It's in your control. So please look around your screen for the Q&A button, and at any time start sending in questions. So after Dave finishes his overview, we will have a back and forth with as many people from as many places in Africa as we can get. So on that note, let me hand the floor over to our distinguished guest, Dave Evans. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you very much, Chris. Let's go to the presentation. So thank you all as well for joining us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we know, like Chris said, what works and why, and specifically about a tool to evaluate that called impact evaluation. Now, obviously, yourselves as journalists are not going to be implementing a bunch of scientific impact evaluations, but journalists have a crucial role in helping to keep public officials and other organizations accountable for whether or not their programs are actually having development impact. And understanding and being educated consumers of impact evaluation can be an excellent way that journalists can fulfill that role. So specifically, in this talk, I'm going to talk about how we can know what works and why. And then I'm going to provide a little bit of guidance of where we can find this evidence on what works. Where can we find impact evaluations about what development programs are actually functioning well in different sub-Saharan African countries? And then third, how can we report responsibly and effectively on what works? So how can we actually characterize accurately what's happening and help public officials and the broader population understand well this evidence? So just to set the stage, here are a few examples of the kinds of questions when we think about whether or not development programs work or not, what we're actually talking about. Imagine, for example, that the government of Nigeria distributes e-readers to secondary school students in 3 states. They put out a press release, they've distributed these e-readers, it's all very exciting. Now the question that ultimately we all care about is, do they actually improve learning? Do these students learn more as a result of having these e-readers? That's the kind of question that we use an impact evaluation to answer. Alternatively, there's a development partner who's been working in Kenya, and they set up school feeding programs in 100 preschools. Again, it sounds great, but do they actually lead to more children coming to school? that lead to improved nutritional outcomes? This is a very important question, and we use impact evaluation to answer it. A third example, just to demonstrate this, goes beyond nutrition, it goes beyond education. A nonprofit in Tanzania, perhaps, is distributing improved hybrid seeds to farmers. Do these seeds actually increase agricultural productivity? Or because they're more sensitive, or for some other reason, are they actually less effective than what we might have expected? Without an impact evaluation, it's very difficult for us to really know the answers to these questions. So, how do we know whether these programs worked or not? So we use a concept, and we're not going to use a lot of technical terms here, but the one that we are going to use here is the word counterfactual. What counterfactual is what would have happened without the program. So we have this program giving the e-readers in Nigeria, or the program in Kenya providing school meals. But then the question that we ask is, well, what would have happened if we hadn't given those school meals? What would have happened if those e-readers hadn't been distributed? What we'd love to do in order to answer this, we'd love to observe the exact same person at the same time with and without the program. So ideally, the way we might do that is we have these two young ladies, it's two different versions of Vanessa Otieno in Western Kenya. And in one case, Vanessa receives this e-reader that she uses in her secondary school class to improve her learning, hopefully. And the other Vanessa doesn't. And as we can see in this particular example, the Vanessa that got the e-reader got this amazing, she got a score of 100 on a test. The other Vanessa didn't do quite so well, right? So in that scenario, we can see exactly what the impact of the program is. But that's impossible unless you have access to some special cloning technology that we're not aware of. So given that we can't observe the same person with and without the program at the same time, how do we come up with a valid counterfactual? How do we figure out what would have happened in the absence of this social program? Well, the most common way to do this is just to compare beneficiaries over time. So I'm sure you've read many reports like this. I've certainly read hundreds, if not thousands, where public officials or people who run programs say, we rolled out this program, we provided these materials to children in schools, we provided this nutritional supplement, and the children nutrition rates have gone down, or malnutrition rates have gone down 20% over the last 2 years. And so what that is simply comparing the beneficiaries over time. Now, the problem with comparing the beneficiaries over time is that a lot of other things might be changing at the same time. So, for example, I was involved in an impact evaluation in Tanzania where the government provided cash transfers to very poor households. It was very exciting. We went and we spoke to a lot of these households, and we asked them what they used the transfers for, and they used them for many things, including increasing their food consumption. But then when we looked at the data, you can see the black line on that screen says how much households were consuming at the beginning of the program before they received these transfers. Then 2 years later, you can see for those households that received the program, the green column, their food consumption had gone up enormously. But then when we looked at other households that hadn't received the program, you can see that their consumption went up just as much. And so, in fact, it wasn't the program that was leading to increased household consumption. These just happened to be great years for the Tanzanian economy. These households were doing better. Now, if the government were to go out and say, we rolled out this program and it led to a 30% increase in household consumption, that would be deeply misleading because, in fact, it wasn't due to the program at all. Now, I will say, just to be clear, this particular Tanzania program had a lot of very positive benefits where things improved in the people who received the program, but not for others. But consumption isn't one of them. And this shows why before-after comparisons, the most common kind of evaluation that we see reported is deeply misleading. So a couple of examples of these kinds of before-after claims. We provided computers to schools and test scores rose 15% over last year. Okay, that's great. Everyone's happy about test scores rising. But is that because that we provided computers to the schools? Or is it because there were other programs happening at the same time, like teacher training programs? Or is it because this year we got a particularly good, talented crop of students? There are all kinds of explanations that simple before and after comparison won't reveal. We built public latrines in 3 markets, and cholera has dropped significantly. Again, these are great outcomes, and no one would deny the value of constructing public latrines. However, over time, we all know cholera outbreaks are due to a lot of things. They're affected by the weather and a number of different vectors. And so just saying over time we built these latrines and the cholera has dropped doesn't really tell us anything about whether the latrines led to the drop in cholera outbreaks. Finally, we provided a goat to poor families, and their incomes rose by this significant proportion. Once again, these households, just like the households in Tanzania, may have had their incomes rising for many other reasons. They might be industrious and trying to find employment and other opportunities already. And so as a result, this before and after comparison just doesn't cut it. So if we can't do the before and after comparison as a reliable way to understand how effective programs are, what should we do? We have to find a comparison group. So a comparison group, and I'm sure many of you already know this, is a collection of students who didn't get e-readers that we want to compare the children who get the e-readers to. So the best comparison group is one that's identical to the people that are receiving the program, except that they didn't get it. That's the only difference before they receive the program. So a lot of people, when we get to this point, a lot of government officials that we talk to and others will say, oh, that's no problem. We've got a perfect comparison group. We've rolled out this program to provide cash transfers to 10 villages. We'll just look at some of the other villages in the country and we'll use that as a comparison group. In other words, we'll just compare the beneficiaries to the non-beneficiaries. On paper, it seems like it might make sense. The trick is that these programs can actually be very different. So, for example, some schools receive feeding programs, some didn't. Why don't we just compare enrollment after the program for these 2 types of schools? Now, here we have 2 schools in I don't remember exactly which country. I'm just kidding. These are fictional schools. And you can see this one school receives the feeding program. They've got a feeding program, and we're interested in whether this led to an increase in how many students attend the school. So you probably don't need me to point out that this one school was already a lot bigger even before the feeding program. In fact, maybe that's why it was selected for the feeding program, because they could reach many children with just one program. And so if we did a comparison and we said, oh, this school that received the feeding program is much bigger, in fact, we'd be attributing this difference in size to this feeding program when in fact it already existed before the program. Now, this is a very obvious example, the size of the schools. But in fact, often with programs, the people who benefit from development programs are very different from the people who don't benefit. Maybe they're more entrepreneurial and they sign up for programs. Just like Chris mentioned at the beginning of this program about this special program that you can apply to. If we just compared the people who apply and get into this program to those who didn't apply at all, obviously they're very different. There are certain kinds of people, perhaps more entrepreneurial, perhaps with more particular interest in this area, that will apply to the program. And so they're just not comparable. And differences in their careers later, we can't just attribute to the program based on this simple comparison. So if we can't do a before and after, and we can't do a simple beneficiary-non-beneficiary comparison, how do we identify this valid control group or this counterfactual? So the best way to do this is to use a lottery, or in other words, to randomize. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, if you can imagine right now, we have all these schools for this school feeding program. Some are small, some are big. Now, if we randomly select which schools get the feeding program, then if we have a large number of schools, then we'll actually end up with the same proportion of big schools in feeding and in the non-feeding group. And so, for example, in this small demonstration I have about, we have one small school and one big school in each group. Now, obviously, this doesn't work if you have a tiny number of schools. If you have one small school and one big school, then using a lottery to decide which one gets the feeding program won't make them comparable. However, if you have 100 schools or 200 schools, and you randomly use a lottery to decide which schools receive the programs, in that case, we actually can be confident that the schools receiving the program, on average, will be very similar to those schools not receiving the program. Now, I'd love to show you just a little video that demonstrates some of the ways that this randomization, implementing a lottery, can actually be used in practice.
There is an exciting new health services program for children in the poorest villages in your country. You are the health minister and have decided to design a rigorous impact evaluation. You may have limited resources to reach everyone with your program. That can actually help you to evaluate its impact. How so? You've identified 300 equally deserving, very poor villages. But your ministry only has enough money to implement the program in 150 of them. The fairest way is to give an equal chance to each village and randomly select 150 to receive the program. The remaining 150 villages which won't receive the health program will be your comparison group. By measuring, then comparing the health outcomes across both sets of villages, you can rigorously evaluate the impact of your program. Now, let's say your ministry does have enough money to reach all 300 villages. Of course, that's great, but what about your comparison group? You still have the opportunity for an impact evaluation if you phase in the program over time. Let's say the program can only reach 150 in the first year. So you randomly select 150 to receive the program in phase 1. Because the remaining 150 don't receive it yet, they act as your comparison group. By comparing the two randomly selected groups, you can evaluate the impact of the program. And in phase 2, the villages in the comparison group will receive the health program. So when your program can't reach everyone, or can't reach everyone at the same time, randomization is a fair, transparent way of selecting who receives it or who receives it first. Plus, it means you've designed a rigorous evaluation to test if your program is really having an impact.
Let's go back to the presentation. I know we had a little bit of a technical problem with the video, but I feel like the audio was actually quite instructive, and we'll provide a link to the video in the notes below the presentation afterwards. So essentially, randomization can work in a lot of contexts. So in Tanzania, this program providing cash transfers, they didn't have enough cash transfers to provide this program initially to all villages that were eligible, and so they randomly selected amongst all the eligible villages which ones would initially receive the program. And that permitted a high quality impact evaluation where we were confident at the end that comparisons indicated what was the impact of the program and not just differences that already existed among these villages. So randomization is one way, and it's the simplest and best way, but it isn't the only way to make up a valid comparison group. Now, because we don't have all day, I'm not going to go through all of the methods, but there are several others. Let me show you just one. For example, let's say you have a feeding program, and the intention is to deliver this feeding program to all small schools. Now, you can see at the bottom of the screen that we have some small schools and we have big schools. I don't want to compare we wouldn't want to compare the schools that are very small to the school that is very big, because of course those schools are very different even before the program. But look at that cutoff right in the middle. So you can see these two schools right near the cutoff are very similar. And so if we look at the difference between those two schools after the program, we'll actually be much closer to gauging the actual impact and how effective this program is. So this is one other way in which we can derive the true impact of the program with an impact evaluation. So remember, the key fundamental question in impact evaluation is the counterfactual, which is what would have happened in the absence of a program. So anytime we're reporting on any sort of research or evidence that makes a claim that this was the impact of this development program or of this policy program, we want to ask, what is the counterfactual they're using? Are they simply relying on a before or after, or are they relying on something else? And if they are, do I believe it? Is it a credible, a valid counterfactual? So let's take a look. We'll give it one more try with the video and see what this looks like in practice with an example from an impact evaluation in Malawi. Just hold on one moment. We're seeing if this video will work for us. Once again, to this video in the notes below at the bottom of the page. However, what this demonstrates in this case is an early child development program where the government of Malawi worked together with researchers, both local and international, to try to identify what was the impact of rolling out better early child development services. And what you'll see when you watch the video later is that these government officials were able to use the evidence from this impact evaluation to make crucial program decisions about how best to serve the children of Malawi. Now, these impact evaluations are truly useful, and they tell us a lot about what the causal impact of a program is. So if I'm reporting on what's happening in Kenya or Nigeria or Tanzania or South Africa, where can I find these impact evaluations as they come out? There are many sources. Some of the most reputable global sources for these are listed here on this page. And I'll show you, for example, the World Bank puts out a whole series of papers and reports on these impact evaluations as they come. If we click through the link here, we can see if one were to click through on the link, what we could see is there's a whole series of papers, and you can go through country by country. There are impact evaluations from Tanzania, impact evaluations from Benin, from Malawi, coming out, new ones coming out each month. The same thing is true in the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. What I list here is the 3IE Impact Evaluation Repository. Recently, we were doing a review of all the impact evaluations available for Kenya, and there were hundreds of impact evaluations on a wide range of sector topics. Likewise, for randomized evaluations specifically, the Poverty Action Lab has many of them listed. Many or most of these impact evaluations are carried out with local partners at universities or think tanks. And so bring in the perspectives of researchers and experts from Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, or wherever the study is taking place. Finally, I'd like to talk about a few key principles of good reporting on impact evaluation. Now, obviously, you'll be better experts on good principles of good reporting than I will as the journalist. But from the researcher perspective, how can we make sure that journalists get this research right? So principle one, when public figures or others make a causal claim, when they say this program led to this outcome, we can push them and say, how do they know, or why do they believe that their policy was the cause of this change? What is the counterfactual? So a great example of this, last year I was working with a large team trying to evaluate what the economic impact of the tragic Ebola epidemic in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea was. Now, soon after Liberia was declared Ebola-free, the White House of the United States put out a press release claiming a great deal of credit for this. Now, it's not, I'm not in a position to decide exactly what the causes for ending the epidemic were. However, it was very clear that the counterfactual, how they believed that their programs had led to this reduction in the Ebola crisis, it wasn't at all clear what the causal link was, what their counterfactual was, why they believed that their program was what had led to this difference. So again, those efforts were much valued and probably did make a difference. But as journalists, you can push figures who make these kinds of claims to try to understand why it is that they believe this and make sure that they're not taking credit for things that didn't initiate from them. Principle two, distinguish clearly between correlation and causation. So often we see things happening at the same time. Without an impact evaluation, it can be difficult to know whether one causes the other. So just as a refresher, correlation, women earn lower salaries. Causation, women earn lower salaries because they are discriminated against in the workplace. So there's nothing wrong with reporting a correlation. Those can be very interesting and very important for the public to know. However, it's important that we don't make a causal claim, that we don't say the reason for this correlation is because of a certain action by an individual or group of individuals, unless we have evidence, which is where the impact evaluations come back in. A third principle, use individual stories that reflect the broader changes and not wild exceptions. So in reporting, a lot of the best reporting that I read tells the stories of individuals who benefit from programs or who don't. Now, it can be tempting to pull out the story of a truly exceptional individual. But if an impact evaluation, if the research shows, for example, that a microcredit program led to no improvement in the lives of most borrowers, then it doesn't make sense to just report the story of one person who had great success. That tends to show people reading that article would walk away with a much bigger impression of the impact. Instead, one can report the story of an individual who reflects more or less the average effect, that actually participated in this program and didn't have a benefit. Or if we really want to highlight the story of someone who has benefited, we may want to counterbalance that with the story of someone who reflects more of the average effect of the program. Principle 4, beware of studies with red flags. So this is a whole course in itself. However, there are a couple of key things that might stand out that have come up recently. One is to be aware of studies with no counterfactual or comparison group. So if the study doesn't mention a counterfactual, if it doesn't mention who they're comparing to, then they're probably relying on a before-after comparison, and it's not a legitimate basis for a causal claim. We should also beware of studies with very small sample sizes. So for example, sometimes people do studies where they compare two villages and a program rolled out in one village and not in the other. Now, of course, as we all know, villages can be different for lots of reasons. And so just relying on this tiny comparison between these two villages to determine the impact of a program doesn't actually tell us the true causal impact. And it can often be an indication that the study overall is less reliable. One bad example of this, there was a study that came out recently. The science is in, the case for a sugar tax is overwhelming. And it reported on the results of a study that worked with 43 children and showed that over the course of 7 days, these children on a new diet were able to have some significant improvements in health. Now, I'm very happy for those 43 children and the week of good health that they enjoyed. But we can all imagine that we don't want to make or encourage big public policy decisions based on 43 children, especially when there's no comparison group and other factors might be happening over the course of those 7 days that drive these results. At the same time, the headline makes a very strong claim. The case for the sugar tax is overwhelming. That's definitely not the case. There's nothing wrong with reporting a wide variety of research, but we need to call it what it is. And when claims are weak, we can put that out there and we can clarify that we really need more evidence before we should take these too seriously. A fifth principle, reach out to the study authors. So many researchers and authors have their email address or phone numbers on their website. I know many researchers, I interact with them regularly, and there are enormous numbers of researchers whose number one desire is for their research, their evidence, to make it into the public sphere, and would like nothing more than to arrange a time to actually talk to journalists who are interested in reporting on the results of their research. Many are hungry. They believe these results can actually make a difference, and they would welcome an opportunity to clarify them. So a bad example of this, so in 2004, there was a very influential paper from Kenya that showed that providing deworming medication to school children had big impacts on their health and education. But last year, some researchers reanalyzed the data and they disagreed with the results. So The Guardian published a debunking article. You can see the headline, "New research debunks merits of global deworming programs." So in today's world where many people read maybe just the headline and the leader, you can imagine they'd walk away and imagine, well, I guess the jury is in. But in fact, most scholars that subsequently examined the data carefully agreed with the original authors, with some exceptions. It's a much more nuanced story. At the same time, the authors clarified that none of the original journalists who were working on these articles made any effort to reach out to them by email, by phone, even though they would have been very happy to clarify these results. Obviously, if you reach out to researchers and they don't return your emails or calls, then that's their choice, but it's worth an effort. There are many researchers that would really welcome this contact. So just to review, a few key principles, and of course there are many more, of good reporting on impact evaluation. First, when public figures or others are making a causal claim, let's push them for how they know that their policy was the cause of the claim. What's the counterfactual? Second, distinguish clearly between correlations and causation, and make sure that we report them as they are. Third, use individual stories that reflect the changes that are observed in good research, not individual stories that demonstrate wild exceptions that give people a very wrong impression of how effective a program is. Beware of red flags, studies that don't have a counterfactual or have an extremely small sample size. And fifth, when in doubt, and maybe even if not in doubt, try reaching out to the study authors and seeing if they have any points to clarify. Obviously, you're independent journalists, and so you're not beholden to report exactly what they say, but their input can be extremely valuable in making sure that you get the reporting on the research right. So a good example of this recently came out of Vox News that reported on an impact evaluation from Kenya that provided cash transfers to households, and it realized that these cash transfers in the course of this randomized study, that households that received the cash transfers were much happier. They also had a number of other positive outcomes, but that their neighbors, other households that didn't participate in the program, were significantly less happy. Now, that might seem obvious to us, but when we design these kinds of programs, that has important implications for how we think about who gets included and who doesn't get included. So what this article does is it highlights how we know there's a causal impact. They highlight that it's a randomized controlled trial. They include quotes directly from the authors that are relevant and support a reasonable interpretation of the findings. And they don't oversell. They say explicitly, it's important not to oversell these findings. One other thing this study does, this article does, which is exceptional, is they point to one other study on the same topic so that we actually have a little bit of context within which to look at the results of this study. That's really great practice. So, to take away, impact evaluation provides valuable evidence on what works by demonstrating a causal impact. And impact evaluations do that through the establishment of what would have happened without the program, what we call the counterfactual. The counterfactual is something that we observe from a credible comparison group, not just a before and after comparison. By reporting on good impact evaluations, you, the journalists, can help public policymakers to be aware of evidence of what works and what does not, and inform future public policies. So journalists can both keep public figures honest about what works and what's not, and help the public to understand what kinds of impacts are truly causal. We'll provide more links to these at the bottom of the page, but there are a number of other resources that are not technical. They don't require an advanced degree in research that can help you learn a little bit more about impact evaluation, how impact evaluation works, and be aware of the latest impact evaluations in your countries that are coming out. Thank you very much.
And Dave, thank you. This was very enlightening. I appreciate the clarity with which you made the presentation, and also the fact that you made it sound really like quite a simple subject, even for somebody like me. I do urge all of our listeners and watchers to bookmark this webinar when it is out, which it will be on YouTube before the end of the day in Washington, maybe the end of the day tomorrow in where you are in Africa. There's a lot of really good stuff in there. Also, please go to the links. We had trouble with videos, but I can tell you that the World Bank site that Dave told us about has quite a few videos, and they're all very well done, short, and quite informative to people who get tired of reading just the written page, as I do. Before we start our discussion, let me please remind you that you're supposed to be part of this discussion. So we really do very much want to see questions from you coming in, and I will be relaying those to Dave as we go along. And when we do our impact evaluation of this webinar, I think one of the key data points is going to be how many questions did you ask, and how many and how well did we answer them.
Although, watch out for that small sample, Chris.
Well, I'm trying to grow the sample as we speak.
Very good.
I suppose the real impact evaluation would be not just whether you ask questions and answer them, but then how does your reporting change?
Truly.
Which is a tougher question, but that's really what we're all about here. So while we wait for some questions from you, please send them. Let me start with some of my own. Let me tell the audience that I actually told Dave some of the questions I was going to ask him, which may not be the best journalism practice. But as we were talking, I actually thought of a different one. So I'm going to pull a little bit of a surprise on you. As you were talking, it occurred to me that you can't really talk about this issue without considering politics. And it seems to me that any agency that is running a program and trying to then show that it is having a positive impact has an incentive not to do impact evaluation the way you do it. I would think if I'm a minister, if I want to look good, it's a lot easier for me to do an evaluation that just says, look how many people I fed, or how many computers I put in schools, or whatever. Given the fact that there must be, I assume, maybe I should ask you, isn't there a real resistance on the part of agencies and people who run development programs to take the risk of doing impact evaluation?
So that's a great question. And I'll tell you, over the last 15 years that I've been working on this with governments across Africa and around the world, I've actually been really surprised. There's been a sea change. And governments are increasingly interested in understanding the true impacts of their program. You're right, we can't escape the politics, and nobody wants to look bad. But one of the great elements of good impact evaluation is that it doesn't give a simple yay or nay, a simple thumbs up or thumbs down. This program worked or it didn't work. Obviously, coming out with a result that says this program was a disaster would be very bad for any government. However, a lot of the times the programs are much more nuanced, and there's important learning that comes out. So I worked with the government of Sierra Leone on an impact evaluation where the government provided textbooks to schools. No one's going to disagree with that, and the government was able to get credit, obviously, and disseminate the fact that they were providing additional textbooks to schools so that students would be better prepared. Now, within the context of the impact evaluation, we didn't see big impacts on learning. And the reason for that was because it turned out that these schools were actually not using the textbooks very effectively. So the government was still able to make the claim that they had rolled out these textbooks, but they were willing to do this impact evaluation, and as a result, learn how they might more effectively get schools to incorporate impact textbooks into their pedagogy. We've seen the same sort of thing. Obviously, in some places, they're big positive effects, but other places, they're much more nuanced effect. And in my experience, in those cases, governments are open, especially if researchers work together with them to make sure that the true nuance comes to light.
Okay. I wonder if also, in a sense, I think the example you gave suggests that impact evaluation makes us think more carefully about what are the goals we really are pursuing. Mm-hmm. We're not really putting textbooks in schools just because we want to support textbook publishers.
Right.
Have you seen, and can you think of examples of where maybe our definition of what the goals of development programs are has changed because of impact evaluation?
Absolutely. So in every case, what we think about, what impact evaluations force us to do is to refine exactly what our objective is. And so, as a researcher and other researchers that I know and work with, when they look at a potential impact evaluation, nobody is truly interested, like you say, in supporting textbooks publishers or potentially, if you're providing school uniforms at schools, supporting the seamstresses and tailors who are providing those school uniforms. What we really care about are these outcomes, whether children are learning in school, whether children are in school. And so as a result, there are a number of cases where we might think, oh, well, let's change a little bit the uptake of this and how this works. So an example of how this has happened is I was involved in an impact evaluation in the Gambia, where the government was interested in training the community and helping them to be more effectively and actively involved in the school community. Over the course of that, we discovered that the teachers, we did some testing of the teachers in the course of the impact evaluation, and the teachers did very poorly on these tests. It was clear that teacher knowledge was extremely low, and that even getting the community involved wasn't going to help this fact that teachers that the teachers didn't know what they were supposed to be teaching. So as a result, the Gambian government launched a complementary intervention to help train teachers and get them into the knowledge space that they were. So in this case, the ultimate goal wasn't to get communities involved. The goal was to get communities involved so that schools worked better. And it became clear in the course of the impact evaluation that more complementary interventions were needed for that, and the government then took action.
Okay. I'd like to ask you a series of questions really about the practical realities that journalists face. And one of these is that my sense is that in a lot of countries, it's hard to find good studies, and it's hard to find good data about your particular country. I'm wondering, aside from the sources that you gave us, like the World Bank, what do you do if you're in a country where you're really having trouble finding the kind of data that is developed the way you say data should be developed? Are there other sources, or are there ways we can make better use of existing studies and sources of information? I know that's a big question, but
yeah, that's a great question. And there are some great solutions on the ground. So it's important to remember the amount of impact evaluation that's happening is increasing every day. And so these global sources that I linked to in the presentation have evidence on almost every country that one could be searching for. New evaluations on Kenya, Ghana, Tanzania, South Africa. But at the same time, almost all of these countries have local think tanks, which are actively doing research. And so if you do a search for think tanks in Kenya or think tanks in Ghana, evidence-based institutions come up. Now, when you look at the websites for these institutions, a lot of times they don't have the exact kind of impact evaluation that I've been talking about today. They have other kinds of research. But this can be really informative research for helping journalists to cover the public policies in country. And it's just important to, when confronting this kind of research, to always ask the same question. What's the counterfactual? Why are people making a causal claim here? Is this just a correlation, some descriptive evidence about how this program is being implemented, or is it actually a causal impact? So a lot of that evidence actually is available from local think tanks and local partners. At the same time, journalists can reach out to the monitoring and evaluation units in governments, for example, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health. Often they're producing reports. Of course, as you signal, not in every case are those reports going to be publicly available. But often the problem is one of dissemination, where reports are available, but maybe the websites aren't very accessible. And so reaching out can provide access to some of this data and information to complement what we're getting from international researchers.
Another problem that journalists often encounter is suspicion on the part of authorities and researchers of journalists. And I know that a lot of times journalists earn that suspicion through our own mistakes and tendency to look for shortcuts or sensational headlines. As a practical matter, I'm wondering how you as a researcher sees a journalist, and what kind of approach from a journalist gives you confidence and makes you want to open up and really share with him or her what you know?
That's a great question. And I'll say, as a researcher, I actually have many times initially encountered that same suspicion, for example, from government officials who think initially that my goal is to expose a failure on their part or some sort. And that's where developing a relationship makes a huge difference. I found that in almost every case, working closely with the people who are implementing the programs help them understand that we're really trying to get at what works rather than just trying to expose some vast problem. Now, I see researchers and I see journalists, and I know many researchers feel the same, as some of my greatest allies. They have a way of getting evidence into the public sphere, into public accountability that I never could through my research papers. And so the kinds of things that I really appreciate when I'm talking to researchers are exactly this. Researchers who, when they've read my study, if they have any questions, reach out to me and ask for clarification. I love it when journalists are interested in context. How does my study fit in with other studies? Is what I found unique, or is it consistent with what other people have found in other countries? I always genuinely appreciate it when journalists let me check the quotes that they take from me. When I should clarify from that, I would never ask a journalist to read an article they were planning to publish or to veto quotes, but simply to make sure that what they're quoting is in fact what I've said. That's proven very useful, and a few times saved both me and the journalist from a little bit of embarrassment where there was some mishearing or the like. Again, the independence of journalists is crucial, and that's part of what makes them such valuable processors of all of this evidence that can have significant impacts on public policy and on anti-poverty programs. And so that's crucial. But working with the researcher to a degree and letting me help make sure that the story is right to the extent that I can is something I really appreciate.
Yeah, at the very beginning of your answer, you said something that really resonates with me, building a relationship. And one thing that I have found as a journalist is that invariably the best stories I've gotten come from people who I already know and have a relationship with. And because of that experience myself, I often tell journalists, go see a researcher when he's not dealing with 10,000 calls about the study he released that day. Talk to him on a quiet day and just say, hey, I'm really interested in this subject in general. What's going on? Mm-hmm. And if at all possible, see him in person. Mm-hmm. Go to his office. I find that the simple human touch can make a huge difference. So I appreciate your answer. It seems to it really rings true to me.
Well, I'd just add to that. I think a great way to find those researchers is either to take advantage of those local think tanks where there are local researchers, or if you're reaching out virtually, places like the Poverty Action Lab, the website that I linked to in the presentation, or the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, they report, and also the World Bank Development Impact Evaluation site, all of them report impact evaluations, not just those that have finished, but that are ongoing. And so you can go onto those sites and identify researchers that are working in areas that you think are important. And like you say, reach out to them, not when their study just dropped and they have 50 calls and opportunities for trying to schedule things, but develop that relationship in advance and start gathering information as these studies develop.
You also, we've talked about flawed studies and the fact that they're, part of our job is to look for the red flags, the flaws. I'm wondering if you can give us some advice about the best way to deal with flawed studies, and in particular, even if a study seems imperfect or seriously flawed, even are there nuggets that you can find even in bad research that make good stories?
And the answer to that is absolutely the case. And so this comes back to this point that journalism and reporting on research and evidence, some of it can be causal impacts where we're confident as a result of a great impact evaluation that this program caused this result. But at the same time, there are a lot of other kinds of reporting that comes out of this evidence. And so, for example, a lot of times these impact evaluations will demonstrate results even in areas that are or demonstrate correlations and key descriptive statistics. So an example of this is this Gambia study that I mentioned, that where teacher training and teacher knowledge wasn't one of the principal goals of the impact evaluation, but buried within that impact evaluation are some interesting data on how much teachers in the Gambia know. And that's newsworthy information. Likewise, at the beginning of the Sierra Leone textbook study, we gathered a fair amount of evidence about whether these textbooks were aligned with the levels of knowledge of the students, whether they could even read and access the textbooks. So even stepping aside from whatever causal claims we make in the impact evaluation, this evidence, this descriptive evidence on how well students do on reading their textbooks is actually really valuable information for people to understand how well their health systems and education systems and anti-poverty programs are actually working. I've found that often, even in studies that are deeply flawed, I can find something of great interest.
Good. Keep reading those studies. We have a question from one of our participants, Joris, who is a journalist from the Netherlands, who does write about development. And let me just read that question. I'm wondering about the ethical part of impact evaluation. Demanding randomized impact evaluation means that aid might be given to comparable groups instead of the needy. That's the question. Does that happen? Also, focusing on impact evaluation, doesn't it take too large a part of the budget of projects that could have been spent actually on delivering services or goods to people?
Mm-hmm. These are two great questions, and it's very important that we interrogate these, each study to make sure that we're actually expecting to get the value out of it that makes it worth whatever costs and risks that come along with it. So on the first question about whether, for example, we're not reaching the most needy, the best way to do these randomized studies, and almost every randomized trial that I've been involved with, and most programs that developing country governments are implementing, they simply don't have the resources to reach all of the needy households. If they did, that could be really wonderful. But in every case, when I've worked in Tanzania, the government doesn't have enough to give cash transfers to all the villages that need them. In Sierra Leone, the government doesn't have enough resources to provide enough textbooks to every student. So given that, the government has to make a choice. Who should get these textbooks now, or which villages should get these cash transfers? So to a degree, you can gauge need and you can say, okay, well, let's make sure we focus on the most needy villages. And that's what the Tanzanian government did. But even amongst the neediest villages, there were nowhere near enough resources to benefit all of them. So then how do you choose? What's the fairest way to choose which village gets the resources? Is it the village whose chief is the nephew of the person who's running the program? Is it a village that, well, we know them because they often come to our workshops? Or is it using a simple lottery where every village gets a fair chance, an opportunity? Every needy village gets an opportunity to potentially get this program now, and hopefully, if the program is successful, to roll it out later to these other villages. On the second point about whether or not we're soaking up resources, there's no denying that impact evaluation does use resources that in some cases could be used for the programs themselves. That's important to consider. That said, I've been working in this field for many years, and I've looked at a lot of programs that people assumed were no-brainers. People assume that giving children in schools textbooks is a no-brainer. Of course that's going to improve learning. Why would we do an impact evaluation of that and use the resources on that? Well, in fact, we did the impact evaluation, and we found out that providing those textbooks to schools wasn't nearly enough. We wouldn't have known that if we hadn't done the impact evaluation. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are the ethics of rolling out programs and using scarce government resources to roll out programs when we don't actually know whether they're having the desired impact or not? If we invest some resources up front to evaluate those programs, then we can scale them up with much greater confidence that we're actually benefiting the households instead of just putting something out that we think will work and that may or may not in the end.
I wonder if you could generalize from that to say that there is a bias in development programs in favor of tangible goods, hardware, textbooks instead of training teachers, building hospitals instead of staffing them adequately. Is that a common pattern, and is impact evaluation really showing us that maybe the emphasis is not on building human capital in the development sector?
So that's absolutely true. And part of this comes back to a point you made earlier, which is about the politics. If I build clinics or if I build schools, and that's something that I can really put in the news and say, all right, we built 50 new schools, and you can see them in your community, and households can walk by, they can see a placard outside that says, this school was built by the administration that you elected a year and a half ago. Whereas with teacher training, often that really happens behind the scenes. And okay, the students are hopefully learning significantly more, but it can be much harder. So the impact is much harder to get the credit that you want for that. So impact evaluation has demonstrated that obviously both of these are important, but that in a lot of countries, these processes that are more invisible to the public eye are actually more crucial, more often the key constraint to getting people great education, great healthcare, great other services are these processes like teacher training and health worker training and reducing absenteeism and these kinds of things. So I think this is another place where journalists can help by making sure that those kinds of programs actually get the same kind of credit as programs that are very easily visible. We built a new school, we built a new clinic, and help politicians have incentives to invest in the programs that really work and not just the programs that are the most visible.
I think that's very, very interesting. If you had just given me that statement in text, I would be highlighting it and I would go back to it. I think that's really useful advice for journalists. We have a question from Nigeria, which I will read. The question is, in Nigeria, the government is trying to copy the World Bank's conditional cash transfer. How do we get data on how the World Bank was able to select beneficiaries of their program now that the Nigerian government is trying to learn from the World Bank? Is there any data about impact evaluation of World Bank's conditional cash transfer program in Nigeria?
This is a great question. So there may be a couple of different programs. I know one specific conditional cash transfer program for secondary school girls in Nigeria. I know that different states are implementing different things, and so that may or may not be the specific program that you're asking about. That said, a couple of resources. So on the website that I mentioned and provided a link to that links to the studies, the World Bank actually has a number of studies about exactly this point that you make about targeting. It's an extremely important and difficult question with cash transfer programs. How do we help make sure that the cash transfers get to the most needy and not just the most friendly or the most visible or this kind of thing? There's been a lot of work done on this. I've done some of that work in cash transfer programs in Tanzania, and others have done it in many countries all over Africa and beyond. And so there are a number of resources. Again, on that site, if you search for targeting and cash transfers, you should be able to identify those. The impact evaluation specifically in Nigeria of the education program, I know is still in process, and I believe that the results haven't come out publicly yet, but hopefully they will soon. And when they do, they'll be on that same website.
Excellent. We have a question now also from Kenya. Whoops, and it just disappeared from my screen. Another technical glitch. Wallace in Kenya, who says he's obviously a very smart fellow because he says this is a wonderful presentation. He says his simple question. He said, we've talked a lot about the sample size as being an important factor in determining the quality of a study. He wonders, is there any time limitation that determines over what period of time should you measure the proper impact? Say, for instance, a project has been implemented for 6 months, and how can you compare that to one that was implemented for just 2 months?
This is an excellent point, Wallace. Thank you very much for bringing it up. In fact, this is one of these indicators of quality that we didn't get to in the presentation, but that we can think could be very, very important. So for example, a study just came out in the last few days looking at the use of cook stoves in India. And what they found was that in the first year, when low-income households were provided with these cook stoves, they used them a lot, and pollution went down in the household, and respiratory challenges went down. But by the end of the second year, a lot of those cook stoves had broken, and people had stopped using them, and almost all of those initial health impacts had disappeared. So in that case, the timing of the evaluation was absolutely crucial. So this is a place where 2 points are important. One is to use your common sense as a journalist. This outcome that we're looking at, is this an outcome that we expect would change within 3 months, within 6 months, within 1 year? Or is this an outcome that we think it really needs some time for that change to take place? So if there's an impact evaluation that claims there's been no change, but it's only been 3 months, and we don't think that change could have happened realistically, then it's important that we report with that exact caveat. So that's number one, is making sure that we keep in mind how long do we expect that it should change. The second point is to keep in mind that changes often, change over time. So exactly in this impact evaluation in India, similarly with that cash transfer evaluation in Tanzania, we didn't see any health impacts when we went back to these households after about 1.5 years. But we went back 1 year later, over time, these households had gotten better off. They'd accumulated new income, and we actually saw improvements in child health in these households. And so when we don't see an impact, or we do see an impact, it's important to interrogate, well, how confident are we that this impact is likely to endure over time, or that the lack of impact is likely to stay the same over the course of time? And I think that's where journalists play a really important role in keeping researchers honest.
I would assume that politicians would have a bias toward projects that have produce quick results.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a tendency to, on the part of the politicians and maybe the voting public and the legislators who appropriate money, in favor of projects that are too short term? And do we need to shift our focus to more long-term results?
I think that there's certainly, and I think this is a true problem. Again, people are bound by the election cycle, and and the need to have people see early on that they're really accomplishing things. And so I think, again, this is where reporting widely on impact evaluations, on what's working, what's not working, can help keep public officials accountable. Are we investing in short-term things that we already have a lot of evidence from other countries just don't work? Or are we investing in things that are less visible, that maybe take a little bit longer to come about, but that we have evidence from other countries with similar systems that actually seem like it might be relevant, that actually work quite well? I think that's crucial.
Good. Here's another question from somebody who remained anonymous. Question: how do you incorporate impact evaluation into an up and running project that did not make provision for such evaluation when it was being planned?
So that's a great question, and thank you for asking it. So I'm just going to underline the importance of setting up evaluations at the same time that people set up projects. And so almost always evaluations that took place, that were designed at the same time that the project was being rolled out, tend to be much more credible. They tend to have much better counterfactuals. You have baseline data from before the program on a comparison group, as well as on the group that's benefiting from the program. And so I just can't underline that enough. If one is doing a program, or if you're a journalist reporting on a program, to look at that as one of the indicators of quality. That said, if a program is up and running, it doesn't mean that all is lost. So obviously you can't go back in time and randomize, although again, if you have the technology for that, my hat is off to you. But if you don't, then there are other alternatives. So for example, I highlighted one example is if there's a cutoff for eligibility for the program, then you can compare households that are just above the cutoff and just below the cutoff and see how different they are. And that can give you a decent estimate of the impact of the program. So even if the program has already started 1 year ago, if there was a cutoff used to determine eligibility, you can actually take advantage of that to do a good impact evaluation, even though you didn't start on time. There are a couple of other methods. For example, in that book that I highlighted on the last slide on impact evaluation and practice that detail this. Again, in every case, you're better off if you can start from the beginning of the project. But if not, there are a number of cases in which you can still do a great impact evaluation.
Good. Let me just see if we've got any new ones here. I also should remind you I find myself on almost every topic that we discuss thinking of several follow-ups. I have the luxury of asking them, but so do you. So if any of the answers inspire you to ask more questions or new questions or clarify questions, please feel free to do that. I'm wondering if there's a role for journalists to play in advocating for changes in the way governments go about, or maybe even private agencies, but especially governments, because that's a special focus for journalists, and how government agencies go about collecting data on programs. In particular, I'm wondering, should there be rules that protect researchers from political interference, that guarantee their independence? Should there be better rules about the transparency of data so that journalists can look at some of the underlying data? Can you suggest, what role do you think journalists should play in advocating for changes like that? And if they should play a role, what changes should we be pushing for?
Right. That's a great question. So I think one thing that journalists, the number one thing is, by consistently holding public officials accountable for the quality of their causal claims, we create significantly stronger incentives for them to actually invest in true, credible impact evaluation. So if every time the mayor is rolling out a new program, journalists, when the mayor announces the program, journalists ask, well, how are we going to know whether this program was effective 1 year from now, 2 years from now? If that is a consistent cry, and then later when the mayor comes out and says, well, we had this before and after comparison, and journalists say, that is not a credible, we just don't believe it, then there's a strong incentive, because that actually gets out, that's what the people interpret. Now, at the same time, like you say, there are systemic changes that journalists can help advocate for. And so one of the things that you mentioned is independence between researchers and government officials. I think that's very important, and in particular to find a middle ground. So often, completely 100% independent evaluations actually end up not being as effective, because like the anonymous commenter highlighted, it's often very difficult to access all of the data that you need in advance of the program, to have access to a baseline. Most of that is most easily done if working in conjunction with the government and closely with them. That said, in almost all the impact evaluations that I and other researchers do with government, we make an agreement, a written agreement in advance, that after the impact evaluation, the results will be made public regardless of what those results are. And now, of course, some governments are more open to that sort of agreement than others. And so journalists encouraging governments and calling on them, holding their feet to the coals, as it were, to make sure that they're open to some degree of independent evaluation, even if it's collaborative, is really valuable. I will say the value of the collaboration is extremely high. Right now, I'm working with the Tanzanian government, and we're doing an evaluation of a decentralization program to strengthen the quality of service delivery for local governments. When we design those questionnaires, working with the Tanzanian government to make sure that we're asking about the right outcomes and measuring the things that their project is actually trying to achieve, I can't understate the value of it. But that said, they have this commitment that we'll share those results. They want to know the true impact of the program, and they're not worried about even if it doesn't come off looking exactly like they imagined from the outset.
So you find that government compliance with those agreements is pretty good?
In general, it's pretty good. I can certainly think of a couple of exceptions, which it would be unwise for me to go into deep detail about right here.
We'll go off the record.
But I will say, I think that's, again, where journalists can help play a role and make sure that governments are open to keeping these agreements.
Okay, I've made a note to myself to grab you in the hall sometime.
Very good.
Get the inside story, get the dirt. And when public radio in Washington, D.C. and throughout the U.S. Goes on one of their fundraising drives, they always say, the clock is ticking, there's just a few minutes left. We actually have under 15 minutes left in the time that we allotted for the webinar. So if you're sitting on some questions and have been reluctant to ask them, your time is running out. So please do get back to us as soon as you can. You've several times given some very useful advice about how journalists should go about their own jobs. But I'm wondering if we can take that a little bit further than you have so far. It seems to me that impact evaluation, as you've described it, is a frame of mind. It's an attitude kind of a skepticism, a determination to really look at real impacts rather than kind of transitional or temporary impacts. And I'm wondering if you were out of the business of covering research and you were just a plain old reporter, can you suggest other ideas you might have about where you'd look for stories and the kind of questions you would ask? How can we do our job in general differently than or better than we are doing it now?
Right. So that's a great question. Obviously, perhaps one that you're even better suited to answer than I. But I will say, outside of the world of research, obviously, reporters are constantly reporting on things for which there's no impact evaluation. So there are a lot of education and health areas for which no impact evaluation exists. And in that case, one of the things that can improve the quality of reporting on that immensely is to be, once again, very careful and look very closely about, is there a causal link in the story that I'm reporting, or am I really seeing a correlation here? So in some cases, we don't have access to an impact evaluation, and we try to puzzle it out and do good investigative journalism and try to figure out what the cause is. And the key is to be very careful there about our language. So when we say that this caused this, or that this led to this, or this led to an improvement in this other thing, whether it's covering research or just covering public programs in general, it's very important that we ask ourselves, okay, how confident am I, even if I don't have a study, that there's a valid counterfactual here? What evidence do we have, even outside of a research study, that in the absence of this program, things would have turned out differently or the same? Sometimes that evidence comes from interviewing people, and maybe we wouldn't put the exact same weight on that as we would on a full-blown research study. But the same principle of asking, what is the counterfactual? What would have happened in the absence of whatever it is that I'm reporting on, I think is absolutely key.
Okay, good. Another question here from one of our viewers or watchers. It's very brief, but I think it's getting to something that's pretty important. It's the questioner is named Felicia, and she asks, what are the goals? Who is doing the evaluation, and who is designing the tactics? That's very brief. I'll just elaborate on it a little bit myself. I think that there's a real question here about are we really defining the actual goals, the ultimate goals of development as clearly and effectively as we need to?
I think that's an excellent question. And I think when we think about research and when we report on research, it's crucial to look at who's carrying out the research and what are the objectives. So good practice research essentially always talks to the beneficiaries themselves, and in many cases asks the beneficiaries what is it that they hope and desire as a result of whatever public program they're participating in. And making sure that we have that connection to individuals on the ground, the citizens, say, okay, we're setting up new schools, a new education program, a new health program. What is it that they desire? And are we, in our research study, making sure that we measure whether those things are changing, not just whether we're accomplishing the goals of a government or the goals of an international institution? Ultimately, the vast majority of researchers that I know are most interested in increasing the welfare for exactly these beneficiaries. But it's crucial to talk to the beneficiaries to make sure that what we think would be valuable and what we think would be improved outcomes for them, whether those are health outcomes or nutritional outcomes, are in fact the outcomes that they're most interested in. And design our research agenda to reflect not only what governments say is a priority, but also what citizens say are priorities in their own national development.
Have you found that there is a real difference in what the ultimate beneficiaries say they want? And can you give us some examples or generalize about at the grassroots, how are people viewing development and what the goals should be, and how different is it from what the elites think people want?
Right. Well, I think the best example I can think of this often doesn't come out of individual studies. So the textbook study that I mentioned in Sierra Leone, when we talk to parents, they want the textbooks to improve their students' learning, just like the Ministry of Education in Sierra Leone wants, and just like the researchers want. But often, when citizens are asked about what are their top priorities, that's where we can sometimes see a difference. So historically, there's been a lot of impact evaluation in the last 20 years in health and education, and I think that's extremely important. Often, though, when citizens are interviewed in a number of different African countries, they highlight that what they most value are things like jobs and income, which then they can use to invest in better education and health. And I think it's crucial that we design the evaluation agenda to be evaluating and researching these areas that people value the most. How can we help people get jobs? How can we increase incomes so that then when they invest in education and health, that's wonderful that those better quality services are there, but we make sure that we align the evaluation agenda with the priorities of people, things like jobs and incomes, and even including roads so that people have access, and energy so that people can start their own businesses and increase their incomes, and again, have access to all those other wonderful social services.
Suppose I am a journalist in an African country and I wanted to write a story and maybe encourage a public discussion about what are the goals of development. Would it be possible to just pull up, a dozen or more impact evaluations and just read them with the idea that I'm just going to look for what are the beneficiaries saying they want? Mm-hmm. And would that be a useful exercise?
So I think that would be an extremely useful exercise. Not every impact evaluation, I'll admit, is as explicit as we might like them to be about the results of beneficiary interviews on what their objectives are. Thankfully, there are a number of research studies. For example, the Center for Global Development has a recurring set of studies that they do that actually ask about priorities of citizens in a number of countries across Africa, for example. So some research just came out from Tanzania recently asking households whether they would prefer receiving cash transfers versus receiving just better quality government services. And households really want well-functioning government services if they can get them. And a number of these kinds of surveys have been done in other countries. And so those tend to come out of research papers, I think maybe less so directly from the more narrowly defined impact evaluations that are looking at the causal impact of programs. But research studies where people are specifically surveyed about what are your top priorities, what is it that you desire the most?
I'd like to go back to our discussion about how journalists interact with researchers. I heard a talk once by a health scientist, and he distinguished between scientific facts and scientific opinion. Mm-hmm. And he pointed out that scientists have opinions too. Would it be useful in interviewing a researcher to just say, not just what do you know, but what do you think? What do you think this study means? Mm-hmm. And maybe get him to talk about what he knows, but also kind of what he thinks the next study should do, what the unanswered questions are.
Absolutely. I think there are two sides to that. One is to make sure that we can report separately what is actually coming out of the research versus what is the inferred opinion from the researcher. Some of the kinds of questions that I think can help elicit that are questions like, what did you expect the outcome to be from the outset of the study? What do other studies on this same topic tell us? Do they tell us the same thing or different things? If they're different, why? So in that sense, we help get at what is the evidence telling us versus what is the opinion. On the other hand, we also have this side that I think you're highlighting, which is that these researchers often are very steeped in this topic and might have some very worthwhile opinions about where the research should go. I think that's extremely valuable. Often, for example, we have researchers who've been working in these topics for many, many years, often within the same country, and have a lot of perspective. And I personally find it extremely valuable to see, well, not only exactly what the research tells us, but where they think the government and other research should be going forward from there.
I think we tend to be, I certainly tend to be in awe of people with your qualifications and knowledge. But I do think maybe it would be useful once in a while to say, what most surprised you? Or what don't you know? What do you wish you know?
Absolutely.
Maybe we can have another webinar on that.
Sounds great.
I think we're just about out of time. I wanted to ask you one kind of philosophical question, and then we can do a brief wrap up. A lot of times, people say they want development, but then they're not happy with what development brings. Environmental harm, crowds, traffic jams, bad air, disruption sometimes to family and community relationships. And I'm wondering if there is how often do impact evaluations get into some of those quality of life kinds of questions? And do we need to do more impact evaluation that looks not just at people's income and how many material goods they have, but whether they're happy and have good relationships and live in stable, peaceful communities?
I think we absolutely need that. And so this one study that I highlighted that was covered by Vox that looked at how cash transfers affected people's happiness, but also affected the happiness of the people around them that didn't receive these cash transfers. So this is one example of saying, let's look at not just whether they have better incomes, better education, better health, but also whether they're happier about the way their lives are going. I think that's very important. At the same time, though that study also illustrates another important point that I think it's crucial to interrogate researchers on, which are unintended consequences. So in this case, the goal of the cash transfer program obviously wasn't to make the neighbors less happy. The goal was to benefit these extremely poor households. But understanding those unintended consequences can be absolutely crucial for how we then design the next round of any particular public program. And so encouraging researchers to look at the specific outcomes of the program, to look at welfare and happiness and life satisfaction, but also to make sure that they look at whatever potential unintended consequences that might be coming out of the program, to make sure we take those into account.
It's interesting. If you're at all a follower of American politics, you certainly can appreciate the fact that there is quite an issue with people who are not the beneficiaries of programs who feel that they have needs too.
Absolutely.
So I think that goes right to the point you made. I like to end every interview that I do with a simple question. Is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have? Sometimes that produces the best story out of the interview. I'm wondering if there's anything today that you really wish we had asked you that we haven't.
Well, the last thing that I'll say, I can't promise it's the best story in the interview, but is that these impact evaluations can make a huge difference in public policy. This is not just a little story in the lifestyle section of on page D17 of the newspaper. Sometimes that's true, but there are a number of impact evaluations that may have made dramatic differences. So here's an example. In Mexico, there was a conditional cash transfer program that gave cash to poor households if they sent their kids to school and got them vaccinated, this kind of thing. It was one of the first programs of its type, before Nigeria, before Tanzania, before almost any other country. The government implemented a very careful randomized trial of the program. As a result of that, and it showed that the program was very effective at reducing poverty. Now, as a result of that, a few years later, the government not as a result of that, but the government changed a few years later. Almost always these big welfare programs get completely changed, right? A new government wants to put forth a new program with their own mark on it. But the evidence on this program was so positive that politically, they just couldn't do it. So all they did was change the name. So the new government got a new name for the program and maybe made some small changes. But ultimately, the program survived the political transition because there was good impact evaluation evidence to support it. And there are smaller examples of this, where, for example, that Gambia impact evaluation, where the evaluation revealed things about teachers that we didn't know and spawned a whole new set of government programs. And so journalists covering these and covering them well can really make a difference in how governments are investing in anti-poverty and other welfare programs.
Good. I was going to suggest that we give you the floor for a few more minutes to do a wrap up, but maybe you feel that you've just done it.
I feel like I've just done it.
Okay. Well, I think that we are at the end of our allotted time. So at this point, we will sign off, but please do remember this webinar will be preserved for the ages. And so you can go back and see it on YouTube. I think there's a lot of material, especially in Dave's presentation, that bears a second viewing and some thinking. You also can see the videos that we failed to get to you fully. I should mention that I'm pretty sure I saw a question a little while ago asking for your email address. So, we'll give you all kinds of links and connections, so you can follow up. And we, as I say, the real impact evaluation for this webinar will be the great stories that start flowing. So please let us know what you do with this information. We really are interested, and keep in mind Impact Africa, because that might give you an opportunity to learn more, and also get some resources to support some really exciting kinds of reporting projects. But on that note, thank you again very much, Dave. It's been a real honor for me to sit next to you and learn from you. And thank you all for watching, and keep in touch.
Thank you very much.